I was recently asked to speak in a church on the topic of does God exist? I was tempted just to say yes and then sit down. After all, speaking on this topic in a church should definitely be preaching to the choir, maybe even literally preaching to the choir. That said, we all go through periods of doubt at times, and so even as Christians, it's good to know why we believe God exists, especially when we go through difficult circumstances. I think it's also worth saying at the outset that this question, does God exist, very much depends on your idea of God. When someone tells me that they are an atheist, I often ask them to describe the God that they don't believe in, and most of the time I can honestly say that I don't believe in a God like that either. Now, I'm not an apologist, so I'm not going to approach this topic in the usual way, laying out a reasoned defence for the existence of God. Instead, I'm obsessed by stories. I love reading fiction, and you may or may not be aware that I've written novels. So in this video, I want to approach the question of God's existence from the perspective of story. In a nutshell, the story with God in it is a better story. This is the central message of the book Life of Pi. Now, if you haven't read the book or seen the film, and you plan to, I should say, spoiler alert at this point. At the beginning of the book, the narrator says, "I have a story that will make you believe in God." Then, most of the book is the story of a boy who is rescued from a sinking ship in a lifeboat with a tiger, a hyena, a zebra, and an orangutan. The tiger ends up killing the other animals, but the boy learns how to keep away from the tiger. And after a few other plot complications, eventually the two of them reach dry land, the tiger disappears into the jungle, and the boy is saved. The narrator then tells a much shorter, far nastier story in which the boy survives the sinking ship with three other people: his mother, the cook, and a young sailor. When the young sailor dies of his injuries, the cook uses him for bait and, unfortunately, for food. And then, when that runs out, the cook kills the boy's mother. Later, the boy ends up killing the cook, manages to survive somehow, and is eventually rescued. The narrator then asks the people from the insurance company who are listening to his stories, which is the better story, the one with the animals or the one without the animals? And they answer, the story with animals is the better story. And then the narrator replies, and so it goes with God. Unfortunately, or perhaps deliberately, the book doesn't go on to explain. It's left to the reader to puzzle it out for themselves. But what I think he's getting at is this: the story with God in it is a better story. Well, now, let me unpack what I mean by looking at the two ways God has chosen to reveal himself as a participant in the story of the universe. In Romans 1:19-20, Paul argues that humans know full well that God exists. They know the truth about God because he has made it obvious to them. For ever since the world was created, people have seen the earth and sky. Through everything God made, they can clearly see his invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature, so they have no excuse for not knowing God. Paul is quite certain of this. Creation demonstrates the existence of God. And this is true for all humans. Anyone can look up at the stars in wonder. Anyone can look at an ice crystal under a microscope and then marvel at the complexity. Anyone can experience the awe that comes from standing near a majestic waterfall. Consequently, theologians refer to this as general revelation. Now, for a bit of science lesson. In the beginning, everyone assumed that God was responsible for everything. Firstly, as the creator of everything, but also as the one who keeps everything going. The movement of the sun, rain, thunder, etc., etc. But as science started to uncover the mysteries of the universe, it left less room for God. This is what is referred to as the God of the gaps. And once you understand the water cycle, you don't need God to make rain fall. Once you understand about electricity, you don't need God to throw lightning bolts or make thunder sounds. Once you understand how planets orbit around the sun, you don't need God to move the sun, moon and stars. Once you understand how animals came to be the way they are through evolutionary means, you don't need God to create them. And once you have a Big Bang, you don't need God to create anything at all. With a clockwork universe, such as the one Sir Isaac Newton describes in his Principia, all you need is someone to start the process, and then step back and everything continues working on its own. This view of God is called deism. And with a deistic view of God, it became easier and easier to write God out of the picture. But in more recent times, we've struck a problem. Science has reached the boundaries of knowledge. And some of these aren't just boundaries that will disappear when the next scientific breakthrough occurs. These are boundaries that are built into the way things are. For example, Heisenberg's uncertainty principle states you cannot know where a particle is, its location, and which way it is travelling and at what speed, its momentum. Chaos mathematics shows that predicting the future of complex systems is impossible. Gödel's uncertainty theorem shows that there exist true mathematical statements that can't be mathematically proved. Stephen Hawking's model of the Big Bang refers to a period shortly after the Big Bang which we can't go back past because space-time comes into existence at some point. And so you can't talk about before that point because there is no time before that point. And, of course, according to some theories of the universe, a vast majority of the matter and energy in the universe cannot be seen or measured, the so-called dark matter and dark energy. Okay, so that one might be solved one day. My point is, if you hold to a God of the gaps model, then maybe you've got some breathing room. But I personally don't hold to a God of the gaps approach. Rather, I believe that God and science can coexist perfectly happily. I have no problem with God creating the universe through a Big Bang and the process of evolution. For me, it's both and, not either or. Which brings me back to my earlier point, the story with God in it is a better story. Some Christian thinkers have pointed out that the universe seems to be deliberately geared towards the emergence of human life. This is known as the anthropic principle. The anthropic principle is all about how certain physics constants have been fine-tuned in just the right way to result in the emergence of intelligent life. For example, the strength of gravity when measured against the strength of electromagnetism. Now, if gravity had been absent or slightly or substantially weaker, then galaxies, stars and planets would not have formed in the first place. Had it only been slightly weaker, or electromagnetism slightly stronger, then stars such as the Sun would have been significantly colder and would not explode in supernovae, which is the main source of many heavier elements. And if gravity had been slightly stronger, then stars would have formed from smaller amounts of material, which would have meant that they would have been much smaller and more short-lived. And similar things can be said about the strength of the strong nuclear force when measured against that of electromagnetism, the difference between the masses of the two lightest quarks, the strength of the weak force, and the cosmological constant which specifies the energy density of a vacuum. When you put all these factors together, it really does seem that the universe is designed to bring about human life. Atheists usually try and get around this problem by saying that there are infinite universes, and so we are here because in this universe the constants just happen to be the way they are. This is convenient because we can't prove or deny the existence of other universes. But I ask you, which story is better? The one where there are an infinite number of lifeless parallel universes, and then there's this one universe where humans just happened to emerge because the random dice rolls fell in precisely the right way, or that there really is a mind behind it all, that someone tweaked all the constants until they were just right, then said, "Let there be light," triggering an almighty Big Bang. Just to make things really interesting, some scientists are actually starting to say that the way quantum mechanics works means that a conscious mind is actually necessary for the universe to even exist in the first place by observing and collapsing waveforms. So I gotta say that science is not the knockdown argument against the existence of God that atheists think it is. Well, I think that's enough science for one day. Suffice to say, the story with God in it is a better story. But given this, it is still possible to ask the question, what sort of God? After all, lots of religions include creation accounts. So when I say that the story with God in it is a better story, you can rightly respond, well, that depends on which God we are talking about. And this is where Jesus comes into it, because Jesus demonstrates the nature of God. Theologians refer to this as special revelation. It's special in the sense that this revelation of God is not necessarily available to everyone. You have to hear about Jesus or read about him in the Bible. As Paul says in Romans 10, "But how can they call on him to save them unless they believe in him? And how can they believe in him if they have never heard about him? And how can they hear about him unless someone tells them? And how will anyone go and tell them without being sent? That is why the scriptures say, how beautiful are the feet of messengers who bring good news." Now, there are plenty of people doing exactly that, going out into all the world and preaching the good news, translating the Bible into the languages of the world, so that everyone has a chance to hear about Jesus. Why is this important? Well, simply put, Jesus reveals what God is like. There is a brilliant conversation in John 14. Philip said, "Lord, show us the Father and we will be satisfied." Jesus replied, "Have I been with you all this time, Philip, and yet you still don't know who I am? Anyone who has seen me has seen the Father." The introduction to John's Gospel also makes this same point. In the beginning, the Word already existed. The Word was with God, and the Word was God. So the Word became human and made his home among us. He was full of unfailing love and faithfulness. And we have seen his glory, the glory of the Father's one and only Son. For the law was given through Moses, but God's unfailing love and faithfulness came through Jesus Christ. No one has ever seen God, but the unique one, who is himself God, is near to the Father's heart. He has revealed God to us. The four Gospels are thus an amazing revelation of God's nature as seen in the person of Jesus, full of unfailing love and faithfulness, as the NLT puts it, or grace and truth, as more literal versions say. This is why when people tell me about the God they don't believe in, I tend to agree with them, because they never describe someone like Jesus. In fact, it's really hard to not like Jesus. So here's a challenge for any atheists out there. Please give the Gospels a read. Because remember, this is special revelation. You can't work this out from first principles. You have to read it for yourself. Try not to get sidetracked by wanting to debunk the miracles. Just look at Jesus' character, the way he interacts with people, and the things that he teaches. And you'll see that full of grace and truth is an apt summary. I hear you object. The Gospels certainly describe a compelling figure, but how can we rely on them as historical documents? Look, this is a vexed question which I don't have time to get deeply into. Maybe a video for another time. But I personally am satisfied that the Gospels are historically reliable. And I have N.T. Wright to thank for this. I remember studying the Bible at Bible college. And I remember reading various authors who approached the Bible from positions of liberal skepticism. Amongst other things, they questioned Jesus' miracles, and the biggest of these is, of course, the resurrection itself. there was lots of talk of resurrection faith. That is, Jesus didn't physically rise from the dead, he just rose spiritually in the faith of the disciples. I confess that I found some of this appealing. It fit with my innate skepticism. But then N.T. Wright wrote a book entitled The Resurrection of the Son of God. And this is his argument in a nutshell. Obviously, Christianity emerged out of Judaism. However, Wright examines all of the beliefs about death and life after death in all of the religions and philosophies that were current at the time of Jesus. And he concludes that you cannot explain historical Christianity, either its theologies or its practices, without a physical resurrection of Jesus. None of the beliefs contained in those first century religions or philosophies would give rise to the beliefs and practices of Christianity on their own. Judaism did expect a resurrection from the dead for the righteous, followed by reward, and possibly also for the unrighteous, followed immediately by punishment. We read about that in Daniel 12, verses 1 to 3. But this was to occur at the end of history. It certainly was not expected of a crucified and therefore failed Messiah, and only him, with regular history continuing. But the gospel accounts of Jesus' physical resurrection provide us with precisely what we need to explain Christianity. Wright's book, therefore, helps to put Jesus' resurrection on a very firm historical footing. Don't just take my word for it, read it, and then go back and reread the Gospels. It might just put them in a whole new light. So when I say that the story with God in it is a better story, the God I am talking about is the one revealed in the person and work of Jesus, the God who is full of grace and truth, who loves us unconditionally. There is a third aspect to this idea that the story with God in it is a better story. The story with God in it is better for humans too. The Bible teaches that humans have dignity and worth because we are all, male and female alike, made in the image of God. The Bible also teaches that God has plans for our lives, so our lives have purpose to love and serve God through the use of our gifts and abilities. And then God's story, specifically Jesus' resurrection, gives us a hope for a future beyond death. And just imagine what the world would be like if everyone lived by Jesus' teaching to treat others as you would want to be treated. So when I say that the story with God in it is a better story, it's not just a better story merely for the sake of it. This story has the potential to bring about actual change to a world that sorely needs it. As Paul puts it, for all creation is waiting eagerly for that future day when God will reveal who his children really are. Against its will, all creation was subjected to God's curse, but with eager hope, the creation looks forward to the day when it will join God's children in glorious freedom from death and decay. So this better story is one that is better for the whole of creation too. This video is already long enough, but I want to address two objections that often come up in the discussion concerning the existence of God. First, the problem of suffering. Okay, so maybe God exists, but if bad things happen to good people, then he's just not worth paying attention to. Another video for another time perhaps. But I follow C.S. Lewis on this. God has given humans free will because he wants us to choose to respond to him in faith. But human free will is a true choice. We can choose to do the right thing or the wrong thing. And that means that humans can do bad things to each other. But what about natural disasters? Surely these acts of God belie all that grace talk. Again, human choice comes into it. If you choose to live near the ocean, near an active fault line, then you have to expect tsunamis. And if you build in an earthquake zone, then you have to expect earthquakes. Actually, this is yet another video for another time, but I actually think this issue rests on the assumption that death is terrible. My response is to note that one can read the first few chapters of Genesis as teaching that humans are actually mortal by design. After all, it was only by continuing to eat from the tree of life that Adam and Eve would live forever. In other words, we did not lose immortality by eating from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Our bodies are mortal, even in the original design. True, the book of Revelation does describe death as an enemy, but death only became an enemy because of sin. And now that Jesus has dealt with the problem of sin, death itself is not a problem. Rather, the issue becomes dying before having had a chance to choose to respond to God with faith. If we die before we have allowed God to deal with our sin, then we are separated from God eternally. And yes, that is terrible. But this is a justice issue which we just have to leave up to God to judge. The second objection is, why doesn't God just make it blindingly obvious, like be interviewed by Oprah on a Netflix special? Again, I think God wants us to utilize our free will. He doesn't want to bulldoze his way into our affections. As far as God is concerned, he has given us enough evidence. Creation, general revelation, and the gospel, special revelation. We just have to take a step of faith towards him. And if you do, then you will enter into a real experiential relationship with the creator of the universe, who, full of grace and truth, loves you unconditionally. And that really is good news. So if you are wondering if God exists, then can I ask you to take that step of faith? Because when you do, you will find that he really is there. And may you always remember this: the story with God in it is a much better story.